So I started this build with the tabletop, and I did use some dominoes here to help keep things aligned. After everything was milled, these boards seemed like they were just a little bit wonky. So once I installed the dominoes, I glued everything up and brushed the glue around, and then just put the boards together. Using these dominoes or floating tenons is really nice because not only do they keep things aligned, but they're extremely strong, which is something you don't get when you use a biscuit joiner. And so with the glue dry, I can go ahead and cut the top to its pre-breadboard end length. And then I started on the breadboards by using my router to create a rabbet on each side of the tabletop, and it essentially makes a tongue. I put out a video recently on how to install breadboard ends using the Festool domino, and I'll link to that here. It was time to cut the grooves in the breadboard ends that would fit into that tongue, so I just made sure everything was centered by flipping my piece end for end and running it through the table saw. And then I ran my shoulder plane over the tongue to kind of sneak up on a nice snug fit. And with all that out of the way, we can go ahead and do a dry fit and see how it fits. Next, I use my Festool domino to create mortises for floating tenons directly in the center of that tongue that we created with the router. To make the mortises nice and wide, I used a piece of tape with 3 different lines on it, and that allowed me to make my mortise size repeatable all the way across. I just had to move the tape to the next location. With that done, I started working on the mortises in the breadboard end, and of course these are wider than the mortises in the table itself, which allow for the expansion and contraction of the table. Next, I started gluing in all of the floating tenons, and I just made these the same way that I make dominoes for my domino, and I'll link a video to show you how I do that as well. The next step is to lay out and drill holes in the breadboard end that go through each mortise for the domino. And then we can install the breadboard end so that we can transfer those hole locations to the tenons. And to do this, you're just going to use the same drill bit that you drilled those holes with and kind of tap it down in there to make a little pin mark. Of course, for this you're going to want to use a brad point bit. And with that done, you can kind of see that little pin mark there. I want to drill the hole in the tenon about 1/16 of an inch closer to the tabletop than that little mark. This is going to create an offset. It's called draw boring, and it's going to pull that breadboard end in really tight to the tabletop. The next step is to take a round file and elongate those holes corresponding with the width of the tabletop. Make sure that you don't expand them with the length, because then you will ruin the offset that you just drilled. And with that taken care of, we can go ahead and install our dowels. They go in pretty tight because of the offset, but it's really neat to see how it really pulls the breadboard end in. And then of course you can flush up those dowels with a flush trim saw. And with the tabletop essentially complete, we can cut it in half, which is always a little scary. And then go ahead and make the mortises for the dominoes that are going to hold the table together when it's not extended, and accept the leaf when it is extended. Essentially, this is what makes this table an extending trestle table. go ahead and glue in the dominoes in the proper locations, in the leaf, and the tabletop itself. Then we can do a test fit just to see how everything comes together. And the next step is to cut the table to its final width. Next, I started working on all the joinery for the leg assemblies, and this is much easier to do while everything is, flat and square and the curves haven't been cut into it yet. And with all the joinery cut, I can go ahead and lay out the actual shape of the legs. And here I'm doing this with a template that I made, and it's only half of the legs so that I can flip it over and have perfectly symmetrical legs. And then it was off to the bandsaw to cut everything out. I cut these extremely close to my line because I decided to use my oscillating spindle sander to do all of the finishing on them, to bring them actually to the final shape in my line, as opposed to using a flush trim bit in my router, which in hindsight would have been much faster. All of the sanding with my oscillating spindle sander took a very long time. And once I sanded everything that I could with the oscillating spindle sander, I came back and got the tight spots with a couple files and some rasps. Next, it was time to cut the mortises for that stretcher that you always think of with a trestle table. So I hogged out most of the waste with my drill press, and then finished them up with some chisels after a nice stropping, of course. And then it was finally time to glue these leg assemblies together. And with all that work done, I started cutting the tenons on the stretcher that will go into those mortises. Next, I started working on the rails that will allow the tabletop to expand and contract, and this is just essentially what's going to become an apron with a tongue cut into it that's going to accept some guides that have a groove in them. And now it is time to assemble everything. As you can see, those tenons were pretty snug in those mortises. And so with the base glued up, I can start working on the top. And here are those guides that have the groove cut in them. And the tabletop actually attaches to these guides and floats above the aprons by about 1/8 of an inch. So here we are putting the two sections of the tabletop on. And after making sure that the tabletop was in the correct spot, I went ahead and started to screw the top to those guides. And here I am testing out the slide design for the first time. Things are very tight here because, it hasn't been waxed or anything like that yet. But it was just more to make sure everything fit and make sure everything worked before going into finish. And so the final step before finish is to install these wedges that you always think of with a trestle table that just sort of tighten everything up with the base of it. And then it was time for finish. So I loaded up my HVLP gun with some shellac and just went to town. And here is just how easy it is to extend this table after it's been finished and waxed. I'm pretty proud of this particular design. I've never seen it before, so if anybody out there has seen this, let me know. Like I said, I've never seen it before.